The paper hearts scattered across the hospital floor were the color of fresh blood, each one carefully cut, meticulously folded, containing a secret that would shatter everything Grace Mitchell thought she knew about protecting children. But that morning, as she bent to pick up the crimson trail leading from the pediatric ward's entrance, she had no idea that a 6-year-old girl's silence would soon become the loudest cry for help she'd ever heard. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning shift at Riverside Children's Hospital began like any other for Grace Mitchell. Spring rain drummed against the windows of the pediatric ward, creating rivulets that distorted the Portland skyline beyond. At 34, Grace had developed a rhythm to her mornings that felt as natural as breathing. Check the overnight reports, review patient charts, prepare medications, and ready herself for whatever challenges the day might bring. She paused at the nurse's station to pour her second cup of coffee, the fluorescent lights casting familiar shadows across the cheerful murals that adorned the walls. Cartoon animals smiled down at her, their painted eyes following her movements as she organized her supplies for the morning rounds. Grace had chosen pediatric nursing specifically for moments like these, when the whimsical decorations reminded her that even in a place of illness, childhood wonder could persist. "Another quiet night," Patty Rodriguez commented, sliding a stack of charts across the counter. Her colleague's warm brown eyes crinkled at the corners as she stretched, her night shift finally coming to an end. Room 304 had some issues with the IV, but nothing major. The new admission in 307, though. She paused, her expression shifting to something more serious. "That one's different, Grace." Grace looked up from her coffee, instantly alert. In their profession, different rarely meant anything good. She'd worked with Patty for 6 years, long enough to recognize when her colleague's intuition was firing warning signals. "What's the story?" Patty glanced around, ensuring they were alone before lowering her voice. 6-year-old girl, Sophie Chen, brought in 3 days ago by her father and stepmother. Official reason for admission was severe dehydration and exhaustion. But Grace... She shook her head slowly. "The child hasn't spoken a single word since she arrived. Not to me. Not to the doctors. Not even to her parents when they visit." Grace frowned, setting down her cup. Selective mutism in children wasn't uncommon, especially following trauma or during periods of extreme stress. But 3 days of complete silence in a medical setting was concerning. Physical injuries, signs of abuse. "That's just it," Patty continued, pulling up the electronic chart on the computer screen. "Nothing obvious. No bruises, no fractures, nothing that screams abuse." Dr. Williams ordered a full workup, including psychological evaluation. But the kid just stares. It's like she's looking through you, not at you, and there's something else. Patty's voice dropped even lower. "She's been making these little paper hearts, dozens of them, leaves them everywhere but won't explain what they mean." Grace studied the chart, noting the meticulously recorded vital signs and test results. Sophie Chen, age 6, admitted with symptoms of severe dehydration and malnutrition. Parents reported she'd been refusing food and water for several days. Prior to admission, no previous medical history of note. Mother deceased 18 months ago from a car accident. Father remarried 6 months later. The timeline made Grace pause. A young child losing her mother, then gaining a stepmother within months. The psychological impact alone could be devastating. Add in the sudden onset of selective mutism and food refusal, and the picture became increasingly complex. "What about the psychiatric consult?" "Dr. Patel saw her yesterday afternoon," Patty replied, stifling a yawn. "Couldn't get her to engage either. recommended continued observation and supportive care. The parents seem, well, the father's clearly concerned. The stepmother. She paused, choosing her words carefully. She's harder to read, very put together, very controlled. Stays for exactly 1 hour during visiting times, then leaves. The father usually lingers longer, but she always insists they go. Grace nodded thoughtfully. Family dynamics in blended families could be complicated, especially when young children were involved. The loss of a biological parent followed by the introduction of a step-parent often triggered behavioral changes, but complete mutism for days was extreme. "I'll make her my first stop this morning," Grace decided, closing the chart. "Sometimes a fresh face helps. Has she been eating at all?" "Barely. Maybe a few sips of juice, a bite or two of crackers. Enough to keep her IV requirements minimal, but not much more." "Oh, and Grace?" Patty gathered her belongings, preparing to head home. Check under her pillow. That's where she keeps the paper hearts she's made. Must be 30 or 40 by now. All red, all identical. It's unsettling. As Patty departed, Grace organized her morning medications, her mind all ready, turning over the details of Sophie Chen's case. In her experience, children rarely went completely silent without profound reason. They might refuse to speak to adults, might whisper only to trusted individuals, might communicate through play or art. But total mutism, combined with food refusal and obsessive paper crafting, suggested something deeper than simple adjustment difficulties. The hallway to room 307 was quiet, the early morning light just beginning to strengthen through the rain-streaked windows. Grace passed rooms where other young patients slept, their doors decorated with drawings and get-well cards. Room 304 had a cluster of balloons tied to the handle. Room 305 displayed a handmade poster declaring "World's Bravest Patient" in crooked, crayon letters. Room 307's door was bare. Grace knocked softly before entering, her trained eyes immediately taking in the scene. The room was dimly lit, curtains partially drawn against the grey morning. Monitors beeped steadily, recording vital signs that appeared stable. The IV drip continued its measured rhythm, delivering fluids to the small figure in the bed. Sophie Chen seemed even tinier than her 6 years suggested. She sat upright against the pillows, dark hair falling in uncombed strands around a heart-shaped face. Her eyes, large and dark, fixed on Grace as she entered, but there was no change in expression, no flicker of interest or fear. In her lap lay a piece of red construction paper, partially folded. Her small fingers worked methodically, creasing and shaping with practiced precision. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Good morning, Sophie," Grace said softly, approaching the bed with deliberate calm. "I'm Grace. I'll be your nurse today." She watched for any reaction, any sign of acknowledgement. Sophie's fingers never paused in their folding, but her eyes tracked Grace's movement across the room. Grace pulled a chair close to the bed, positioning herself at Sophie's eye level. In pediatric care, she'd learned that physical positioning mattered. Towering over a frightened child only increased their sense of vulnerability. "That's a beautiful heart you're making," she observed, keeping her tone conversational. "Red is my favorite color too." Sophie's fingers stilled for just a moment, so briefly that Grace might have imagined it. Then the folding resumed, careful and precise. Grace noticed that the child's fingernails were bitten down to the quick, several showing signs of recent bleeding. Anxiety behavior, compulsive habits, the signs were accumulating. "I used to make paper cranes when I was your age," Grace continued, pulling the blood pressure cuff from the wall. "My grandmother taught me. She said if you made 1,000 of them, you could make a wish come true. Do the hearts have special meaning too?" No response. Sophie allowed Grace to check her vital signs without resistance, her thin arm limp as the blood pressure cuff inflated. Temperature normal. Blood pressure slightly low, but within acceptable ranges for her size and condition. Heart rate elevated, but that could be attributed to anxiety or the presence of a stranger. Grace noticed the pile of completed hearts on the bedside table, each one identical in size and shape, folded with remarkable precision for a child's hands. She counted at least 20 visible, with more presumably tucked under the pillow, as Patty had mentioned. "May I look at one?" she asked, reaching slowly toward the pile. Sophie's hand shot out faster than Grace expected, covering the hearts protectively. It was the first definitive response she'd shown, the first indication that she was fully aware and engaged with her environment. Grace withdrew her hand immediately, respecting the boundary. "I understand," Grace said gently. "They're special to you, private. That's okay." She settled back in her chair, considering her approach. "You know, Sophie, sometimes when we can't use words, we find other ways to communicate. Drawing, music, even paper folding. I had a patient once who would only communicate by blinking. One blink for yes, two for no. We had entire conversations that way." Sophie's dark eyes remained fixed on Grace, unblinking. The paper heart in her lap was nearly complete, its edges sharp and precise. Grace noticed that the child's hands, despite their small size, moved with unusual dexterity. The muscle memory of repetition was evident in every fold. "Your dad will be visiting later this morning," Grace mentioned, watching carefully for any reaction. "He's been very worried about you." A slight tension appeared in Sophie's shoulders, barely perceptible but definitely present. "And your stepmom, too. They both want you to feel better soon." At the mention of her stepmother, Sophie's folding stopped entirely. Her small body seemed to shrink further into the pillows, and for the first time, her gaze dropped from Grace's face. The completed heart in her lap crumpled slightly under suddenly tense fingers. Grace filed the reaction away, her internal alarm system beginning to ping more insistently. She'd seen enough cases of family dysfunction to recognize the signs. Children rarely showed such marked responses to parental figures without cause. The challenge was determining whether this was normal adjustment difficulty or something more sinister. "Sophie," Grace said, leaning forward slightly, "I want you to know that this is a safe place. The hospital, this room, with me. Whatever is making you feel scared or sad, you can share it here. Even if you can't use words right now, there are other ways to help me understand." The child's eyes lifted again, and for a moment, Grace thought she saw something flicker in their depths. Fear, hope. But then the shutters came down again, and Sophie returned to her paper folding with renewed intensity. Another heart joined the growing collection, red as all the others, carrying secrets in its crisp folds. Grace spent another 20 minutes with Sophie, chatting one-sidedly about inconsequential things. The rain outside, the cartoon characters. On the walls, the breakfast options that would arrive soon. She didn't push for responses, didn't demand interaction. Sometimes, she'd learned, the most important thing was simply to be present, to establish herself as a safe person in the child's world. As she prepared to leave for her next patient, Grace paused at the door. "Sophie, I'll be back to check on you in a little while. If you need anything at all, just press this button." She indicated the call button clipped to the bed rail. "Even if you can't tell me what you need, I'll come, okay?" Sophie's fingers never paused in their folding, but Grace caught the slightest nod, progress, however minimal. She left the room with a heavy heart and a growing conviction that Sophie Chen's silence held more than simple grief or adjustment issues. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm of medications, treatments, and patient care. Grace found her thoughts returning repeatedly to room 307, to the silent child and her red paper hearts. During a brief break, She cornered Dr. Williams. In the hallway, the Chen girl, she began without preamble. As anyone looked into the family situation more deeply, the stepmother especially. Dr. Williams, a tall man with prematurely grey hair and kind eyes, frowned thoughtfully. Standard social services screening was done at admission. No red flags in the system. The father's a respected investment banker. Stepmother's an interior designer with her own firm. They live in West Hills, good neighborhood. Why? Are you seeing something? Grace hesitated, knowing that her intuition, while often accurate, wasn't sufficient grounds for formal investigation. She responded differently when I mentioned her stepmother and the selective mutism, the compulsive paper folding. It feels like more than grief to me. Kids process trauma differently, Dr. Williams reminded her, though his expression remained thoughtful. Losing a parent at that age, then having to adjust to a new family dynamic. It's not unusual to see behavioral regression or communication issues. But he held up a hand as Grace started to protest. I trust your instincts. Keep observing, documenting. If you see anything concrete, we'll escalate to social services. Grace nodded, unsatisfied but understanding the limitations. The system required evidence, not just intuition. She couldn't simply declare that something felt wrong and expect immediate action, but she could watch, wait, and be ready when Sophie finally decided to share whatever burden she carried. The father arrived just before 10, as predicted. Grace observed from the nurse's station as Daniel Chen made his way down the hallway. He was younger than she'd expected, early 30s, with the polished appearance of someone accustomed to professional success. His suit was expensive, but wrinkled, suggesting he'd come straight from an early meeting. The worry lines around his eyes seemed deeply etched, aging him beyond his years. She intercepted him before he reached Sophie's room. Mr. Chen, I'm Grace Mitchell, Sophie's nurse today. I wondered if we could chat for a moment before you go. In? Daniel Chen turned, his expression immediately anxious. Is she okay? Has something changed? Is she talking yet? The questions tumbled out in rapid succession, revealing the depth of his concern. Her condition is stable, Grace assured him, guiding him to a quiet corner. I wanted to ask you about Sophie's behavior before she came to the hospital. The silence, the food refusal. Was there any precipitating event? Any changes at home? Daniel ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture that reminded Grace strikingly of Sophie's own anxious movements. She's been quieter since her mother died, he admitted. Emma was. She was everything to Sophie. They were incredibly close. But this, he gestured helplessly toward his daughter's room, this complete shutdown is new. It started about a week ago. Rachel thought she was just being stubborn at first, refusing to eat dinner, not answering questions. But when she stopped, drinking water, his voice cracked slightly. And your wife, Rachel, Grace prompted gently. How has Sophie's relationship with her been? Something flickered across Daniel's face, too quick to categorize. It's been an adjustment. Rachel tries very hard, maybe too hard sometimes. She wanted to be a mother to Sophie right away, but Sophie hasn't been receptive. She still asks for Emma constantly, still sets a place for her at dinner. Rachel finds it difficult. Grace nodded, processing this information. Step-family integration was never simple, especially when one parent had died rather than divorced. The child's loyalty to the deceased parent often created barriers to bonding with the step-parent. Has Rachel ever expressed frustration about Sophie's attachment to her mother's memory? She's only human, Daniel said defensively. Of course it's frustrating when you're trying to build a relationship and the child keeps pushing you away, but Rachel would never. She loves Sophie. She's trying so hard to be a good mother. The defensiveness was telling. Grace had learned to read between the lines of parental statements, to hear what wasn't being said as clearly as what was. "Of course," she agreed diplomatically. "Blended families face unique challenges. Has Sophie received any grief counseling since her mother's passing?" "We tried," Daniel admitted, but Sophie wouldn't engage. She just sat there silent, making those paper hearts. The therapist said to give her time, that children process grief differently. But it's been 18 months, and if anything, she's getting worse, not better. Grace made a mental note to request the therapy records. If Sophie had been exhibiting selective mutism for that long, it suggested deeper issues than simple grief. "The paper hearts," she said carefully. "When did she start making those?" Daniel's face clouded. "Right after Emma died. She learned it from her mother. They used to make them together, leave them in each other's lunchboxes, under pillows, little love notes. After Emma died, Sophie kept making them, hundreds of them. She leaves them everywhere. Rachel wanted to stop her, said it wasn't healthy to cling to the past that way, but I couldn't. They're all she has left of her mother." The picture was becoming clearer, though still incomplete. A grieving child clinging to maternal memories, a stepmother struggling with constant reminders of her predecessor, a father caught between them. It was a common enough scenario, but something about the intensity of Sophie's response continued to nag at Grace. "Would it be all right if I sat in on your visit?" she asked. "Sometimes having a familiar medical presence helps children feel more secure." Daniel nodded eagerly. "Anything that might help. I just want my little girl back, the Sophie who used to laugh, who used to tell me elaborate stories about her imaginary friends, who used to sing in the car. This silent ghost. It's killing me." They entered the room together to find Sophie exactly as Grace had left her. Still folding, still silent, her collection of hearts growing steadily. At the sight of her father, something shifted minutely in her expression. Not quite a smile, but a softening around her eyes. "Hey, sweetheart," Daniel said, his voice artificially bright. "How are you feeling today? The nurses tell me you're being very brave." He approached the bed slowly, as if afraid of startling her. Sophie's hands stilled on her current heart. She looked at her father, then at Grace, then back to her lap. Deliberately, with careful precision, she finished the heart she'd been working on and held it out to Daniel. "For me?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Sophie. It's beautiful." He accepted the heart with reverence, cradling it in his palm like something infinitely precious. Grace watched the interaction closely. Sophie's selective gift-giving was significant. She'd protected the hearts from Grace, but freely offered one to her father. It suggested trust, or at least a differentiation in her relationships. The question remained, was the stepmother notably absent from this circle of trust? And if so, why? "Rachel wanted to come," Daniel continued, settling into the chair beside the bed. "But she had a client meeting this morning. She sends her love. She's planning to visit this afternoon." At the mention of Rachel, Sophie's recently relaxed posture stiffened again. Her hands, which had paused in their folding, resumed with almost frantic intensity. Another heart took shape, but this one seemed different somehow. The folds were sharper, more aggressive, the creases pressed with unnecessary force. "Sophie," Grace interjected gently, "your dad and I were just talking about how much he misses hearing your voice. But we understand if you're not ready to talk. Yet, is there anything else you'd like to share? Maybe through your hearts?" Sophie looked up, her dark eyes meeting Grace's with unexpected intensity. For a long moment, she seemed to be weighing something, making a decision. Then, with deliberate movements, she reached under her pillow and withdrew a small stack of red paper hearts. Grace and Daniel watched as Sophie spread them out on the white hospital blanket. At first glance, they seemed identical to all the others. But then Sophie began arranging them in a specific pattern, her small fingers moving with purpose. She placed them in rows, some face up, some face down, creating what looked like a code or message. "What is it, sweetheart?" Daniel asked, leaning forward. "Are you trying to tell us something?" Sophie nodded, the first clear response she'd given to a direct question. She pointed to each heart in sequence, as if indicating they should be read in order. Grace felt her pulse quicken. This was communication, deliberate and purposeful. Whatever message Sophie was trying to convey, she'd chosen this moment, with both her father and a trusted adult present, to share it. "Can you show us what they mean?" Grace asked softly. Sophie hesitated, then began unfolding the first heart. Inside, in crayon so faint it was barely visible, was a drawing. A stick figure of a woman with long dark hair, lying horizontal. Flowers. Around her, a child figure standing beside her, tears drawn as blue lines down the face. "Mommy," Daniel breathed, his voice catching. That's Emma's funeral." Sophie nodded and unfolded the second heart. This one showed two figures, the same child and a different woman, this one with short blonde hair. The blonde figure held something in her hand. A bottle? The child figure was at a table, a plate in front of her. Grace leaned in, studying the simple drawing. "Sophie, is this you and Rachel? At dinner?" Another nod. Sophie's fingers moved to the third heart, but before she could unfold it, footsteps echoed in the hallway. The door swung open, and a woman entered without knocking. Tall, impeccably dressed, with professionally styled blonde hair and expertly applied makeup. Rachel Chen carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to controlling her environment. "Daniel, there you are," she said, her tone carrying a hint of reproach. "I thought we agreed on afternoon visits." Her gaze swept the room, taking in Grace, the scattered paper hearts, and Sophie's frozen posture. "What's all this?" The change in Sophie was instantaneous and dramatic. She swept the hearts together in one motion, crushing them against her chest. Her entire body seemed to fold in on itself, shoulders hunching, head dropping. The brief moment of communication slammed shut like a door in a hurricane. "Rachel," Daniel stood, his voice carrying a note of apology. "I thought you had a client. Meeting, Sophie was she was showing us something." Rachel's perfectly painted lips curved into a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "How wonderful. Is she finally talking?" She approached the bed, and Grace noticed how Sophie seemed to shrink further with each step. "Sophie, darling, Mommy's here now. Have you been giving the nurses trouble with your little paper games?" The word "mommy" hung in the air like a false note in a familiar song. Grace saw Daniel wince slightly, saw Sophie's knuckles whiten as she clutched the crushed hearts. The tension in the room ratcheted up several notches. "She hasn't been any trouble at all," Grace interjected smoothly. "In fact, we were just making some progress with communication. Sophie was sharing something important with us." Rachel's gaze fixed on Grace, assessing and dismissive in the same glance. "And you are Grace Mitchell, Sophie's nurse today." "I see." Rachel's tone suggested she saw entirely too much. "Well, I'm sure you have other patients to attend to. Daniel, and I need some family time with our daughter." The dismissal was clear, but Grace hesitated. Something about the way Sophie had recoiled, the timing of Rachel's arrival, just as the child was beginning to open up, set off every professional alarm she possessed. But without concrete evidence, without Sophie's direct disclosure, her hands were tied. "Of course," Grace said carefully. "I'll be just outside if you need anything. Sophie, remember what I said about the call button, anytime at all." As she left the room, Grace caught a glimpse of Sophie's face. The child's dark eyes followed her retreat with something that looked heartbreakingly like abandonment. The paper hearts remained crushed against her chest, their secrets still hidden in careful folds. The hallway outside Sophie's room stretched before Grace like a tunnel of decisions. Each step away from room 307 felt like abandonment, yet she had no legal grounds to remain. Hospital protocol was clear. Family time was sacrosanct unless there was immediate danger. She paused at the nurse's station, her trained ears straining to catch any sound from the room she'd just left. Patty's replacement for the day shift, Marcus Thompson, looked up from his charting. "Everything okay with the Chen girl?" he asked, noting Grace's troubled expression. Marcus was fresh out of nursing school, eager and observant, but still learning to read the subtle signs that came with experience. "I'm not sure," Grace admitted, glancing back toward the closed door. The stepmother just arrived and the whole dynamic shifted. Sophie was finally starting to communicate through these paper hearts she makes, showing us drawings inside them. Then Rachel walked in and everything just stopped. Marcus frowned, his youthful face creasing with concern. "Should we notify someone? Dr. Williams, maybe?" Grace considered this, weighing her options. "Not yet. I need more than just a feeling, but I want to review Sophie's full medical history, including any previous hospital visits. Can you pull up the records from other facilities?" While Marcus began the search, Grace positioned herself at the computer, where she could maintain a clear line of sight to room 307. She began documenting her observations from the morning, carefully noting Sophie's selective responses, her reaction to Rachel's name versus her father's presence, and the interrupted communication attempt with the paper hearts. 15 minutes passed before the door to Sophie's room opened. Rachel emerged first, her cell phone already pressed to her ear, speaking in clipped tones about rescheduling appointments. Daniel followed, his shoulders slumped in defeat. Grace noticed immediately that his hands were empty, no paper hearts, no evidence of Sophie's attempted communication. "Mr. Chen," Grace called softly, intercepting him as Rachel continued down the hallway. "How did the visit go?" Daniel's face was a study in frustration and confusion. "She completely shut down. Wouldn't even look at us. Rachel tried to get her to eat something, but..." He shook his head. "I don't understand what happened. She was just starting to show us something and then..." Children can be overwhelmed by too many visitors at once," Grace offered diplomatically. "Sometimes they need to process things slowly, especially when they're not feeling well." "Rachel thinks we're coddling her," Daniel said, his voice low. "She believes Sophie is manipulating us with this silence, trying to get attention. She wants to bring in a behavioral specialist, someone who can break through what she calls willful defiance." The phrase sent a chill down Grace's spine. In her experience, labeling a traumatized child's behavior as manipulation often preceded more aggressive interventions. Has Sophie exhibited defiant behavior before her hospitalization? Daniel hesitated, glancing toward his wife, who was now gesticulating emphatically as she spoke on the phone. "There have been incidents. Sophie sometimes hides Rachel's things. Once she cut up one of Rachel's design portfolios. Rachel was furious, said it cost her a major client. But Sophie had never been destructive before Emma died. She was such a gentle child." "Grief can manifest in many ways," Grace said carefully. "Children don't always have the words to express their feelings, so they act out. It's not manipulation, so much as communication through behavior. That's what I try to tell Rachel, but she has very firm ideas about child rearing. She thinks I'm too permissive because of my guilt over Emma's death." Daniel's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Maybe she's right. Maybe I am failing Sophie by not being firmer." Grace saw her opportunity. "Mr. Chen, would you be open to having our child psychiatrist, Dr. Patel, conduct a more thorough evaluation? Not just of Sophie, but of the family. Dynamics as a whole? Sometimes an outside perspective can help everyone understand what's really going on. Relief flickered across Daniel's features. Yes, I think that would be helpful. Rachel might resist, but if it's presented as standard medical procedure... I'll speak with Dr. Patel this afternoon, Grace promised. In the meantime, I'd like to continue working with Sophie one-on-one. Sometimes children open up more easily when parents aren't present. The pressure to please or protect family members can inhibit communication. Daniel nodded eagerly. Anything that might help. I just want my daughter back. He glanced again toward his wife, who was ending her call with visible irritation. I should go. Rachel wants to discuss next steps over lunch. But thank you, Grace, for caring about more than just Sophie's physical symptoms. As the couple departed, Grace noticed how Rachel walked slightly ahead, never looking back to see if Daniel followed. The body language spoke volumes about their relationship dynamic, one leading, one following, with little true partnership. Evident. Marcus looked up from his computer screen as Grace returned to the station. Found something interesting, he said, turning the monitor so she could see. Sophie was brought to St. Mary's ER about 4 months ago. Official reason was accidental ingestion of cleaning supplies. Grace leaned in, scanning the report. Accidental? That's what's documented. She apparently drank from a bottle of bathroom cleaner. Stomach was pumped, observed overnight, then discharged to parents. But look at this note from the attending nurse. Marcus highlighted a section of text. Child appeared anxious around stepmother. Repeatedly asked for Nana, maternal grandmother. Father stated grandmother lives out of state. Stepmother insisted child was being dramatic, seeking attention. Child became increasingly agitated until stepmother left room, then calmed significantly. Grace felt the pieces of the puzzle shifting, forming a picture she didn't like. Any follow-up? CPS was notified as standard procedure for ingestion cases, but the investigation was closed. Parents cooperative, home environment deemed safe. Child's explanation of mistaking it for juice was accepted. Marcus paused. But there's something else. The cleaning product she allegedly ingested. It was lavender-scented toilet bowl cleaner, kept under the bathroom sink, according to the report. No child mistakes toilet cleaner for juice, Grace said flatly. The smell alone would be a deterrent, and it would have been in an obviously different container. Were there any other hospital visits? One more, 6 months ago, fall downstairs resulting in a sprained wrist. Again, stepmother brought her in. Again, documented as accidental. Marcus pulled up the second report. But the radiology tech noted something odd. The injury pattern was more consistent with a twisting motion than a fall, like someone had grabbed and yanked the arm. Grace's jaw tightened. The pattern was becoming clearer, though still circumstantial. Print both reports for me. I want Dr. Williams to see these before we proceed with any formal notifications. Returning to Sophie's room, Grace knocked softly before entering. The child lay curled on her side, facing away from the door. The paper hearts she'd clutched so desperately earlier were nowhere visible. The lunch tray sat untouched on the bedside table, the sandwich and fruit cup exactly as Dietary had arranged. Them. Just me, Sophie, Grace announced quietly. Your parents have gone to lunch. It's just us now. Sophie didn't move, but Grace caught the slight tension in her small shoulders that indicated awareness. She approached the bed slowly, pulling the chair close but not speaking immediately. Sometimes silence was the best invitation for communication. Minutes ticked by, marked only by the steady beep of monitors and the distant sound of rain against windows. Finally, Sophie rolled over, her dark eyes finding Grace's face. The paper hearts, Grace noticed, were tucked beneath her pillow, edges visible but contents protected. I'm sorry your visit was interrupted earlier, Grace said softly. You were being very brave. showing us those drawings. Would you like to continue? Just you and me? Sophie's gaze flicked to the door, then back to Grace. Her small hand moved toward the pillow, then hesitated. Grace understood the fear, the calculation happening behind those watchful eyes. Trust was a fragile thing, especially for a child who'd learned that adults could be dangerous. "I promise," Grace said, meeting Sophie's gaze steadily. "Whatever. You show me whatever you need to tell me, I will listen. And I will believe you. Sometimes grown-ups don't want to see things that are hard or scary, but my job is to keep children safe, even when the truth is difficult." Something shifted in Sophie's expression. She pulled 3 paper hearts from beneath her pillow, the same ones she'd begun to unfold earlier. With careful fingers, she smoothed out the first one they'd already seen, the funeral scene. The second heart, partially revealed before Rachel's interruption, showed more detail than Grace had initially noticed. The blonde woman held what was clearly a medicine bottle, tipping it toward the child's plate. The child figure had X's for eyes, a universal symbol for distress or danger. "Sophie," Grace said carefully, "is this showing me something that really happened? Did Rachel put something in your food?" Sophie nodded, then held up 3 fingers. 3 times? Another nod. Sophie unfolded the third heart. This drawing was darker, more frantic in its execution. It showed the child figure in what appeared to be a bathroom, the blonde woman forcing something toward her mouth. Toilet bowl cleaner, Grace realized with a sick feeling. The accident from 4 months ago. "Oh, Sophie," Grace breathed. "Is this why you stopped eating? Because you were afraid of what might be in the food?" Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded emphatically. She reached for another heart, unfolding it to reveal a drawing of the blonde woman holding the child figure's arm, twisting it. The fall down the stairs that wasn't a fall at all. Grace's mind raced. This was disclosure, clear and documented, but she needed more, needed Sophie to confirm what the drawing suggested. "Sophie, I need to ask you something very important. Has Rachel been hurting you, making you sick on purpose?" Sophie nodded, tears now flowing freely down her pale cheeks. She grabbed another heart, frantically unfolding it. This one showed something different. The blonde woman standing over a bed where a dark-haired woman lay. The dark-haired woman had X's for eyes. Above the blonde woman's head, Sophie had drawn what looked like a bottle of pills. Grace's blood ran cold. "Sophie, is this about your mommy? About Emma?" Sophie's nod was violent, desperate. She grabbed Grace's hand with both of hers, squeezing with surprising strength for such a small child. Her mouth opened, and for the first time in days, sound emerged. Not words, but a keening whimper that conveyed more than language ever could. "It's okay," Grace said, though nothing about this situation was okay. "You're safe now. I believe you. I'm going to help you." She reached for the call button, years of training overriding her emotional response. "I need to get Dr. Williams and some other people who can help. Is that okay?" Sophie nodded, but her grip on Grace's hand didn't loosen. With her free hand, she pulled out one more heart, pressing it urgently into Grace's palm. This one was different, not unfolded, but sealed somehow. The edges pressed so tightly they'd begun to tear. "Should I open this now?" Grace asked. Sophie shook her head violently, then pointed to Grace's pocket. "Hide it," the gesture seemed to say. "Keep it safe." Grace slipped the heart into her scrub pocket, making a mental note to examine it later when she could do so privately. The next hour unfolded with practiced precision. Dr. Williams arrived within minutes, followed by Dr. Patel and Linda Torres from Social Services. Grace stayed with Sophie throughout, her presence seeming to provide the anchor the child needed to continue her brave disclosure. With gentle prompting, Sophie recreated her drawings on fresh paper, adding details that painted an increasingly horrific picture. Rachel adding crushed pills to Sophie's food, Rachel forcing cleaning products down her throat when Daniel was at work. Rachel grabbing and twisting her arm when she refused to call her mommy. And most chilling of all, Rachel standing over Emma's bedside in the hospital after the car accident, doing something with the IV line while Sophie watched from the doorway where she wasn't supposed to be. "We need to contact the police," Dr. Williams said quietly, having stepped into the hallway with the other professionals. "This goes beyond child abuse. If what Sophie's suggesting about her mother's death is true, it would need to be investigated as a potential homicide," Linda Torres finished. "I'll contact Detective Coleman from the Special Victims Unit. She has experience with cases involving children as witnesses." Grace felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. What about Sophie's immediate safety? The parents will return soon, and if Rachel suspects that Sophie has disclosed... "Emergency protective custody," Linda said firmly. "I'll get the paperwork started immediately. The hospital can maintain medical custody while we sort out the legal aspects. Dr. Williams, can you document medical necessity for continued hospitalization?" "Absolutely. Malnutrition, dehydration, psychological trauma requiring intensive intervention. We have more than enough justification." As the professionals dispersed to their various tasks, Grace returned to Sophie's room. The child had exhausted herself with the emotional revelations and lay curled on the bed, clutching a single red paper heart. Her eyes tracked Grace's movement, still wary, but no longer completely shuttered. "You were very brave today," Grace told her, smoothing the blanket. "I know how hard it was to share those things, but you did the right thing. We're going to make sure you're safe now." Sophie's hand crept out from under the blanket, finding Grace's. She squeezed it once, then pointed to Grace's pocket where the sealed heart rested. "I'll keep it safe," Grace promised. "Whatever's inside, I'll make sure the right people see it." As if summoned by the promise of approaching drama, Rachel's voice echoed down the hallway. "I don't care what your policies are. I want to see my daughter now." Grace moved to the door, positioning herself protectively. Through the window, she could see Rachel striding down the corridor, Daniel hurrying to keep up. 2 security guards flanked them, clearly having been alerted to the situation. "Mrs. Chen," Dr. Williams intercepted them smoothly. "I need to speak with you and your husband in my office. There have been some developments regarding Sophie's condition." Rachel's perfectly made-up face flushed with anger. "Developments? What kind of developments? And why are there security guards following us?" "Please," Dr. Williams maintained his professional calm. "My office is more private. This concerns Sophie's medical care and some serious allegations that have been made." The word allegations hit Rachel like a physical blow. Grace watched as the woman's expression cycled through surprise, fear, and finally settled on indignation. "Allegations? What are you talking about? If that child has been telling stories..." Mrs. Chen, Linda Torres, appeared at Dr. Williams' side, her identification badge prominently displayed. "I'm with Child Protective Services. We need to discuss your stepdaughter's welfare. Please come with us." Daniel looked between the professionals, confusion evident on his face. "What's going on? What allegations? Is Sophie okay?" "Your daughter is safe, Mr. Chen," Dr. Williams assured him, "but she's made some serious disclosures about her treatment at home. We need to investigate these claims thoroughly." "This is ridiculous," Rachel snapped. "Sophie hasn't even been speaking. How could she make allegations? This is clearly some misunderstanding." Grace noticed how Rachel's first instinct was denial, not concern for what Sophie might have experienced. It was telling, the reaction of someone more worried about accusations than about a child's well-being. "Sophie found a way to communicate," Grace said, stepping forward. "Children often do when they feel safe enough to share their truth." Rachel's gaze fixed on Grace, and for a moment the mask slipped, Pure hatred flashed in her eyes before being quickly suppressed. "You!" she said, voice dripping with venom. "You've been poisoning her against me from the start. I saw how you looked at me this morning, judging me, deciding I was the evil stepmother before you knew anything about our family." "Ma'am." One of the security guards stepped forward. "You need to go with Dr. Williams now. This isn't a request." As the group moved toward the administrative offices, Daniel hung back, catching Grace's arm. "Please," he said, desperation clear in his voice. "What did Sophie say? What's happening to my family?" Grace chose her words carefully. "Mr. Chen, Sophie shared some very concerning information about her experiences at home. The authorities need to investigate to ensure her safety. I know this is overwhelming, but right now, the focus has to be on protecting Sophie." Protecting? From what? From Rachel? Daniel's face crumpled. "That's not. Rachel loves Sophie. She's strict sometimes, yes. But she would never. She couldn't. Sometimes the people we trust most are capable of things we never imagined," Grace said gently. "The investigation will uncover the truth. Right now, Sophie needs you to listen to her, to believe her, even if what she's sharing is hard to accept." Daniel nodded numbly, then followed the others toward Dr. Williams's office. Grace watched him go, seeing the moment when doubt crept in, when the careful construct of his rebuilt family began to crack. Returning to Sophie's room, Grace found Dr. Patel sitting beside the bed, speaking softly to the child. Sophie's eyes were closed, but her breathing suggested she was awake. "Listening, she's processing everything," Dr. Patel said quietly as Grace approached. "It's exhausting for children to carry secrets like these. The relief of disclosure often leads to immediate emotional and physical fatigue." Grace nodded, checking Sophie's monitors. "Has she said anything? Verbally, I mean." "Not yet, but she's responding to yes or no questions with nods. It's a start." Dr. Patel stood, gathering her notes. "I'll want to do a more thorough evaluation once she's rested. The trauma she's experienced. It's going to take time to unpack it all." As Dr. Patel left, Grace settled into the chair beside Sophie's bed. The rain had intensified outside, drumming against the windows with increasing force. It felt appropriate somehow, as if the weather was reflecting the storm that had just broken over this small family. Sophie's eyes opened, finding Grace's face in the dim afternoon light. Her hand moved to her chest, where Grace could see the outline of another paper heart beneath her hospital gown. "Do you want to rest for a while?" Grace asked. "I can stay here if you'd like. You don't have to be alone." Sophie nodded, then did something that surprised Grace. She reached under her gown and pulled out a paper heart, not red like all the others, but white. Hospital letterhead, Grace realized, folded into the familiar shape. Sophie pressed it into Grace's hand, then pointed to her pocket where the sealed red heart rested. The message was clear. This white heart was connected to the sealed one somehow. Grace unfolded it carefully, finding not a drawing but words. Shaky, childish printing that must have taken enormous effort for small fingers more accustomed to pictures than letters. "She killed Momi. I saw. She put bad medicine in the tube. Momi got sleep and never waked up. She said if I tell she make me sleep too, forever sleep like Momi." Grace's hands trembled as she read the words. This was what Sophie had been carrying, the terrible secret that had stolen her voice and made food a source of terror. Her mother's death hadn't been an accident or a result of car crash injuries. If Sophie was telling the truth, and Grace believed she was, Emma Chen had been murdered by the woman who then stepped into her place. "Oh, Sophie," Grace whispered, folding the white heart carefully. "You've been so brave, carrying this all by yourself for so long." Sophie's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they seemed different. Not tears of fear or pain, but of relief. The terrible burden she'd carried alone for 18 months was finally shared. Someone knew, someone believed, someone would act. Grace knew the investigation that would follow would be complex. 18 months had passed since Emma's death. Evidence would be hard to find, witnesses scarce. But Sophie's consistent disclosure, the medical records of her own abuse, the pattern of escalating violence, it would be enough to start. And sometimes, starting was all justice needed. The sealed red heart in Grace's pocket seemed to pulse with its own weight as she sat beside Sophie's bed, watching the small chest rise and fall with each breath. The white paper heart, with its devastating message, lay folded in her other pocket. Both pieces of evidence that would need to be properly documented and handed over to authorities. But for now, in this quiet moment after revelation, Grace simply held space for a child who had finally unburdened herself of an impossible secret. Detective Sarah Coleman arrived within the hour, her unmarked car pulling into the hospital parking lot just as the afternoon shift change began. Grace watched from the window as the detective emerged, a woman in her early 40s with short auburn hair and the kind of purposeful stride that suggested someone accustomed to difficult conversations. She carried a leather portfolio and a small recording device, tools of a trade that dealt in human darkness. Dr. Williams met the detective at the pediatric ward entrance, briefing her in hushed tones as they walked towards Sophie's room. Grace could see the detective's expression growing more grave with each step, her professional mask settling into place as she absorbed the preliminary details of the case. Grace Mitchell? Detective Coleman extended her hand as she entered the room. I'm Sarah Coleman, Special Victims Unit. I understand you're the nurse who Sophie first disclosed to? Yes, Grace confirmed, noting how the detective's eyes immediately swept the room, taking in every detail. The medical equipment, the scattered paper hearts on the bedside table, Sophie's small form beneath the blankets. It was the practiced observation of someone trained to see what others might miss. Is she awake? Detective Coleman asked softly, her entire demeanor shifting as she focused on the bed. Gone was the brisk professional who'd strode down the hallway. In her place stood someone who understood that traumatized children required infinite gentleness. Sophie's eyes were indeed open, tracking the new arrival with a wariness that had become her default response to the world. Grace moved closer to the bed, placing herself within Sophie's line of sight. Sophie, this is Detective Coleman. She's here to help, just like Dr. Williams and I are helping. Is it okay if she talks with you for a little while? Sophie's gaze moved between Grace and the detective before she gave the slightest nod. Her hand crept toward Grace's, seeking the anchor of familiar presence in the face of yet another stranger. Detective Coleman pulled up a chair, positioning herself at Sophie's eye level. Hi, Sophie. You can call me Sarah if you'd like. I know, you've had a really hard day, sharing some very difficult things. I want you to know how brave that was. My job is to help keep children safe, and what you've told Nurse Grace is going to help me do that. She opened her portfolio, revealing not the official forms Grace expected, but a collection of simple drawings. Sometimes when I talk to children about hard things, we use pictures to help. Would that be okay with you? Sophie's interest sparked slightly. She nodded again, her grip on Grace's hand loosening marginally. Great, Sarah smiled warmly. Now, I understand you've been making some beautiful paper hearts. Nurse Grace told me they're very special. Could you show me one? Sophie hesitated, then reached for one of the red hearts on her bedside table. She held it out tentatively, watching the detective's reaction carefully. Sarah accepted the heart with appropriate reverence. This is beautiful work. The folds are so precise. Did someone teach you how to make these? For the first time since her disclosure, Sophie's lips moved. No sound emerged, but the shape of the word was clear. Mommy. Your mommy taught you. Sarah's voice remained gentle, encouraging. That must be a very special memory. Sophie nodded, then suddenly reached for the paper and crayon that had been left within reach. With quick, determined strokes, she drew two figures, one tall with long dark hair, one small. They sat at what appeared to be a table, both holding paper. Hearts floated between them like butterflies. You and your mommy making hearts together, Sarah observed. That looks like a happy memory. Can you show me more about your mommy? What followed was a careful dance of communication. Through drawings, nods, and the occasional mouthed word, Sophie began to share her story with the detective. Sarah proved skilled at asking questions that could be answered non-verbally, building trust with each gentle inquiry. Grace watched in admiration as the detective worked. She knew that everything Sophie communicated would need to be carefully documented, that these drawings and gestures would become part of a legal case that could potentially charge Rachel Chen with murder. But Sarah never let the weight of that responsibility rush the process. She moved at Sophie's pace, validating each revelation with appropriate solemnity. When Sophie drew the hospital room where her mother had died, Sarah's questions became even more careful. You were there when your mommy was in the hospital? Sophie nodded, then drew herself hiding behind a door. Her crayon moved to create another figure, the blonde woman approaching the bed where the dark-haired figure lay, connected to various lines and tubes. You saw Rachel come into the room, Sarah clarified. Were you supposed to be there? Sophie shook her head vigorously, then drew what appeared to be a clock showing late hours. She mouthed a word, sleeping, then pointed to herself and made a gesture indicating she had woken up. You were supposed to be sleeping, but you woke up and went to see your mommy, Sarah interpreted. And that's when you saw Rachel? The story emerged in heartbreaking fragments. Sophie had been staying with her grandmother during her mother's final hospitalization, but she'd convinced her grandmother to bring her for one last visit, promising to be good, to let mommy rest. She'd fallen asleep in the family waiting room, but had woken up alone. Her grandmother had stepped out, perhaps to get coffee or use the restroom. 6-year-old Sophie had wandered down the hallway to her mother's room, wanting just to see her, to make sure she was okay. The door had been slightly open, and through the gap, she'd witnessed Rachel doing something to the IV line. Her mother, who had been improving according to the doctors, had suddenly gone very sleepy, and then the machines had started making loud noises. Did Rachel see you? Sarah asked gently. Sophie nodded, her small face crumpling with remembered terror. She drew herself running, then being caught by the blonde figure. Above Rachel's head, she drew words in a speech bubble. Tell, you sleep too. Grace felt her throat tighten as she watched Sophie relive that terrible night. The child had carried not just the trauma of losing her mother, but the knowledge that the loss hadn't been natural, and the terror that she could be next if she spoke the truth. Sophie, Sarah said carefully, I need to ask you about something specific. Did you see what Rachel did to the IV line? Did she put something in it? Sophie nodded emphatically. She drew a small bottle, then mimed the action of injecting something into a tube. Her eyes moved to Grace, and she pointed to her pocket, where the sealed red heart still rested. Is there something about that in the heart Nurse Grace is keeping safe? Sarah asked. Sophie nodded again, but held up her hand in a stopping motion when Grace moved to retrieve it. Not yet, the gesture seemed to say. Instead, Sophie reached under her pillow and pulled out another heart, this one yellow, made from what looked like a sticky note. She unfolded it carefully, revealing not a drawing but an object taped inside. A small glass vial, empty, but for a few drops of clear liquid at the bottom. The label was partially torn, but still readable. Potassium chloride. Grace's medical training kicked in immediately. Potassium chloride, when injected in concentrated doses, could cause cardiac arrest. It was one of the drugs used in lethal. injections, and in a hospital setting it would be readily available but strictly controlled. "Sophie," Grace said, her voice carefully controlled despite her racing pulse, "where did you get this?" Sophie mimed picking something up from the floor, then pointed to the drawing of the hospital room. She'd found it after Rachel left, after the machines started alarming, after the nurses rushed in and pushed her out of the room. In the chaos of attempted resuscitation, no one had noticed a small vial that had rolled under a chair, except for a traumatized 6-year-old who understood, with the devastating clarity that children sometimes possess, that this small bottle was connected to her mother's sudden decline. Detective Coleman's expression remained professionally neutral, but Grace could see the impact of this revelation in the tightening around her eyes. Physical evidence in a case 18 months old was unexpected and potentially game-changing. "Sophie, you've been very brave keeping this safe," Sarah said. "Can you tell me why you put it in the paper heart?" Sophie reached for the crayon again, writing letters with painstaking care. "Mommy said heart, safe." The tragic logic of a child's mind became clear. Her mother had taught her that paper hearts were symbols of love and safety. So when Sophie found herself in possession of something dangerous, something that frightened her, she'd hidden it the only way she knew how. Inside a paper heart where love was supposed to keep scary things at bay. "We need to stop the interview here," Detective Coleman said quietly, closing her portfolio. "This evidence needs to be properly collected and documented. Sophie, you've done an amazing job today. I know this was hard, but you've helped us understand. What happened to your mommy?" As Sarah stepped out to make the necessary calls, Grace remained with Sophie. The child looked exhausted, but somehow lighter, as if the physical act of handing over the vial had lifted a weight she'd been carrying far too long. "Grace?" The voice was so soft, Grace almost missed it. Sophie had spoken, actually spoken, for the first time since her admission. "Yes, sweetheart." Grace leaned closer, her heart pounding. "Is Rachel going to jail?" The question, delivered in a whisper barely above breath, carried such hope and fear that Grace had to swallow hard before answering. "The police are going to investigate everything you've told us. If Rachel hurt your mommy and hurt you, then yes, she'll have to answer for that." "What about Daddy?" Sophie's voice grew slightly stronger, though still fragile as spun glass. "Will he be mad at me?" Grace chose her words carefully. "Your daddy loves you very much. He might be confused and sad at first, but that's not your fault. You told the truth, and that's always the right thing to do." Sophie considered this, then nodded slowly. "Mommy would want me to tell the truth." "Yes," Grace agreed. "I think she would." The next several hours passed in a blur of official procedures. Crime scene technicians arrived to properly collect the vial and document the chain of custody. The sealed red heart was carefully opened in the presence of witnesses, revealing what Sophie had hidden inside: a photograph. It showed Emma Chen in her hospital bed, smiling weakly at the camera, with Sophie curled beside her. But in the background, slightly out of focus but unmistakable, was Rachel Chen standing by the IV pole, her hand on the line. On the back of the photograph, in different handwriting, an adult's hand, were the words, "Insurance policy, just in case." "Oh my God," Grace breathed, recognizing the implications. Emma knew. She suspected Rachel might try something. Detective Coleman studied the photograph with intense focus. "This appears to have been taken by someone else. See the angle? Someone else was in that room, someone Emma trusted enough to take this picture." Sophie, who had been growing more verbal as the afternoon progressed, tugged on Grace's sleeve. "Nana," she whispered. "Nana Margaret took the picture. Mommy asked her to watch Rachel." The investigation was expanding rapidly. Within an hour, Sophie's maternal grandmother had been contacted. Margaret Liu, 73 years old and living in Seattle, broke down in tears when Detective Coleman called. Yes, she'd been suspicious of Rachel from the beginning. Yes, Emma had asked her to document Rachel's hospital visits. Yes, she had more photographs. I should have said something sooner, Margaret sobbed over the phone, her voice carrying through the speaker. But Emma made me promise to wait, to watch over Sophie first. She said if anything happened to her, Sophie would need protection more than justice. As evening approached, the hospital room had transformed into something resembling a command center. Dr. Williams worked with hospital administration to secure all records from Emma Chen's stay. The original death certificate, listing cardiac arrest as the cause of death, was being reviewed. Security footage from 18 months ago was being retrieved from deep storage. Through it all, Sophie remained the calm center of the storm. Having finally given voice to her truth, she seemed to gain strength with each passing hour. When a child advocate arrived to support her through the process, Sophie clearly but politely stated she wanted Grace to stay with her. "You listened," she explained simply, "when I could only show, not tell." The door burst open just as the dinner trays were being delivered. Rachel Chen stood there, her perfectly composed facade cracking at the edges. Behind her, Daniel looked shattered, his face a map of disbelief and growing horror. "I demand to see my daughter," Rachel announced, but her voice lacked its usual authority. "This is a witch hunt, a misunderstanding. Sophie is a troubled child who's been traumatized by her mother's death. She creates fantasies." "Mrs. Chen," Detective Coleman stepped forward, flanked by two uniformed officers. "I need you to come with us for questioning regarding the death of Emma Chen and the abuse of Sophie Chen." "This is ridiculous." Rachel's voice rose to near hysteria. "Daniel, tell them! Tell them how Sophie makes things up, how she's been disturbed since Emma died." But Daniel wasn't looking at his wife. His eyes were fixed on his daughter, who had pressed herself back against the pillows but hadn't looked away. "Sophie," he said brokenly, "is it true? Did Rachel hurt you?" Sophie met her father's gaze with a courage that seemed impossible in someone so small. "She hurt Mommy first," she said clearly. "Then she hurt me. I'm sorry, Daddy. I wanted to tell you, but she said she'd make me go to sleep forever like Mommy." The truth, spoken aloud in the presence of witnesses, seemed to shatter something fundamental in the room's atmosphere. Daniel's legs gave out and he sank into the nearest chair, his face in his hands. Rachel's denials grew more frantic, but the officers were already moving to escort her out. "You can't believe her," Rachel shouted as she was led away. "She's a child, a traumatized, disturbed child. Daniel, you know me. You know I loved Emma like a sister." But Daniel wasn't listening anymore. He was staring at his daughter, really. Seeing her perhaps for the first time in months. The weight loss he'd attributed to grief, the silence he'd thought was stubbornness, the fear he'd dismissed as adjustment issues. All of it reframed in the light of Sophie's truth. As the chaos of Rachel's arrest faded down the hallway, a different kind of silence settled over room 307. Sophie looked at her father, waiting. Grace held her breath, knowing this moment would shape everything that came next. "Sophie," Daniel whispered, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." He rose unsteadily, approaching the bed like a man walking through a minefield. Can I hug you?" Sophie studied him for a long moment, then nodded. When Daniel gathered her gently into his arms, mindful of her IV line and her fragile state, she didn't pull away. But she didn't relax either, holding herself still as if waiting to see if this embrace would turn into another betrayal. "I should have seen," Daniel murmured into her hair. "I should have protected you, both of you." Grace quietly excused herself. giving father and daughter privacy for their first honest moment in 18 months. In the hallway, she found Detective Coleman coordinating with her team. The vial tested positive for potassium chloride residue, Sarah informed her. Combined with the photograph and Sophie's testimony, we have enough for charges. The DA is reviewing the case now, but it's looking like murder in the first degree for Emma Chen's death, plus multiple counts of child abuse and attempted murder for what she did to Sophie. Grace nodded, feeling exhaustion settle into her bones. The adrenaline that had carried her through the day was finally ebbing. What happens to Sophie now? The CPS will work with Mr. Chen, assuming he's cleared of any knowledge of the abuse. Extended family will be evaluated. The maternal grandmother seems like a strong candidate for support. Sophie will need extensive therapy, of course, but children are resilient, especially when they're believed. As Grace walked toward the nurse's station to complete her charting, she passed the room where Sophie had spent 3 days in silence. The red paper hearts still scattered across the floor told their own story. A child's desperate attempt to communicate the unspeakable, to honor her mother's memory while protecting herself from a fate she feared was inevitable. By the time Grace returned to check on Sophie an hour later, the scene had transformed again. Margaret Liu had arrived on an emergency flight from Seattle, and the room now held 3 generations of a family beginning to heal. Sophie was speaking freely now, her voice growing stronger with each sentence, as if the very act of truth-telling was restoring something essential that had been stripped away. She said Mommy had a bad heart, Sophie was explaining to her grandmother. That's why she died, but Mommy's heart was good. It was full of love. That's why we made the hearts, to show how much love there was. Daniel sat silent, listening to his daughter reveal the depth of deception he'd lived with. Grace could see him struggling to reconcile the woman he'd thought he'd married with the monster Sophie described. It would be a long journey for him. It too, learning to trust his own judgment again, learning to prioritize his daughter's voice above all others. As her shift neared its end, Grace found a quiet moment alone with Sophie. The little girl was tired but peaceful, her small hand still folded around a paper heart, this one white, made from a tissue. "Thank you," Sophie said simply, "for listening, for believing." Grace smoothed the child's hair back from her forehead. "Thank you for being brave enough to tell. Your mommy would be so proud of you." Sophie smiled, the first real smile Grace had seen from her. "I know. She told me in my dreams to find someone who would listen. She said the hearts would show the way." As Grace left the hospital that evening, she thought about the power of listening, of creating space for truth to emerge in whatever form it needed to take. Sophie's paper hearts had indeed shown the way, through silence to speech, through fear to safety, through isolation to connection. The investigation would continue. There would be trials, testimony, and the long work of rebuilding a shattered family. But tonight, a little girl was safe. A truth had been heard. A mother's murder would not go unpunished. And sometimes, Grace reflected as she drove home through the Portland streets, that was enough. Sometimes saving one child, believing one impossible story, was exactly what healing looked like. In her pocket, she still carried one of Sophie's red paper hearts, a gift pressed into her hand as she'd said goodbye for the evening. She would keep it always, a reminder that the smallest voices often carried the most important truths, and that love, folded carefully and carried close to the heart, could survive even the darkest circumstances. The morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows 8 months later, casting long shadows across the polished floor where Grace Mitchell stood, adjusting her collar one final time before entering the courtroom. The November air carried the crispness of approaching winter, so different from that rainy March day when Sophie Chen had first arrived at Riverside Children's Hospital in silence. Today, Sophie would speak again, but this time her words would carry the weight of justice. Grace spotted Daniel Chen near the security checkpoint, his appearance transformed from the polished investment banker she'd first met. His suit was still expensive, but worn with less attention to perfection, his face showing the lines that came from confronting hard truths about one's own blindness. Beside him stood Margaret Liu, Sophie's grandmother, her silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, her hand resting protectively on Sophie's shoulder. And Sophie herself. The change was remarkable. 8 months of therapy, proper nutrition, and the safety of truth had transformed her from the skeletal, silent child into someone who stood straighter, smiled more readily, and met the world with eyes that, while still watchful, no longer held that haunted quality that had first caught Grace's attention. "Nurse Grace." Sophie's voice, clear and "Strong now," called out across the lobby. She broke away from her grandmother to run toward Grace, her dark hair bouncing with each step. The reunion hug was fierce and genuine, so different from the tentative touches of those early days. "Look at you," Grace said, holding Sophie at arm's length to admire her. "You've grown 3 inches at least." 3¼ Sophie corrected with a grin. "Dr. Patel measures me every month. She says I'm catching up to where I should be." The courtroom was already filling when they entered. The trial of Rachel Chen had captivated Portland's attention, a respected interior designer charged with murdering her best friend to marry her husband, then systematically abusing the woman's child to keep her silent. The media had been relentless, though the judge had issued strict orders protecting Sophie's identity. Rachel sat at the defense table, her appearance as meticulously crafted as ever, though Grace noticed the designer clothes couldn't quite hide the way her shoulders curved inward. The defensive posture of someone whose carefully constructed world had collapsed. Her attorney, a sharp-featured man in his 50s, leaned close, whispering last-minute instructions. The prosecutor, Amanda Reeves, approached their group as they took their seats. "Sophie, are you ready? Remember, you can take breaks whenever you need them, and your support dog will be right there with you." Sophie nodded, her hand finding her grandmother's. "I'm ready. I want to tell the truth about Mommy." The trial had already been underway. For 2 weeks, the physical evidence had been presented, the vial of potassium chloride with its damning residue, hospital security footage that had been enhanced to show Rachel entering Emma's room at the crucial time, financial records showing Rachel had taken out a large life insurance policy on Emma just months before her death as a gift to ensure Sophie's future. Expert witnesses had testified about the effects of potassium chloride injection, about the pattern of injuries documented on Sophie's small body, about the psychological impact of threats and systematic abuse on a grieving child. Rachel's own colleagues had reluctantly admitted noticing her obsession with Daniel Chen, even while Emma was alive, her comments about how Emma didn't appreciate what she had. But today was different. Today, the jury would hear from Sophie herself. The therapy dog, a golden retriever named Courage, was already in place when Sophie took the witness stand. Special accommodations had been made. A lower chair, a screen to block her view of Rachel, permission to hold a comfort object. Sophie had chosen one of her paper hearts, red like all the others, folded with the same precision her mother had taught her. "Can you tell us your name for the court?" Amanda Reeves began gently. "Sophie Mingli Chen," Sophie answered, her voice carrying clearly through the courtroom's sound system. "I'm 7 years old. Sophie, do you understand why we're here? Today? Yes, to talk about what happened to my mommy and what Rachel did to me." The defense attorney stood. "Objection," leading the witness. "Sustained. Rephrase, counselor." Amanda nodded. "Sophie, can you tell us about the night your mother died?" Sophie's small fingers tightened on the paper heart, but her voice remained steady. "I was supposed to be sleeping in the family room. Nana was with me at the hospital because Mommy was getting better and we wanted to be there when she woke up all the way. But I had a bad dream and woke up. Nana wasn't there. She left a note that said she went to get coffee. I wanted to see Mommy to make sure she was okay. What happened when you went to your mother's room? The door was open a little bit. I saw Rachel inside. She wasn't supposed to be there. Visiting hours were over and Daddy had gone home. But Rachel had a special badge because she told the nurses she was Mommy's sister. Grace remembered learning this detail during the investigation, how Rachel had manipulated hospital staff, presenting herself as Emma's concerned sister-in-law to gain after-hours access. "What did you see Rachel do?" Amanda asked. "Sophie's..." Her voice dropped lower, but she continued. "She had a little bottle, like the medicine bottles the nurses used. She put a needle in it and pulled up the medicine. Then she put the needle in Mommy's IV tube and pushed it in. Mommy's eyes opened for a second, and she saw Rachel. She tried to say something, but then her eyes closed and the machines started beeping really loud. What happened next? Rachel saw me. She grabbed my arm and pulled me into the room. She said, if I ever told anyone what I saw, she would give me the same medicine and I would go to sleep forever like Mommy. She said no one would believe a little kid anyway, and she would be my new Mommy so she could do whatever she wanted to. Me. The courtroom was utterly silent, except for the court reporter's keys and someone's muffled crying in the gallery. Sophie continued, her voice gaining strength as she recounted months of abuse, the forced ingestion of cleaning products when Rachel claimed she was dirty inside, the twisted arm when she refused to call Rachel Mommy, the systematic poisoning of her food that led to her desperate food refusal. Why didn't you tell your father? Amanda asked gently. Rachel said she would hurt him too. She said she had special medicine that could make it look like a heart attack, just like with Mommy. She said Daddy trusted her and would never believe me, and I thought maybe I was bad. Maybe if I had been better, Mommy wouldn't have died. Grace felt tears sliding down her cheeks. The guilt Sophie had carried, the way Rachel had weaponized a child's natural self-blame, it was almost too much to bear. Sophie, when did you decide to tell someone? When I got so sick, I had to go to the hospital. I thought maybe Rachel had finally given me the forever sleep medicine. But then I met Nurse Grace, and she was different. She saw my paper hearts and didn't tell me to stop making them like Rachel did. She said they were beautiful, like Mommy used to. And when Rachel left the room, she asked me real questions and looked at me like she would believe whatever I said. What made you trust Nurse Grace? Sophie thought for a moment. She knelt down to talk to me instead of standing over me. She asked if I felt safe. Nobody had asked me that since Mommy died. And when I showed her the first drawing, she didn't say I was making things up or being dramatic. She just listened. The cross-examination was gentle. Even Rachel's attorney seemed reluctant to attack a child witness too aggressively. He focused on trying to establish that Sophie might have been confused, that the trauma of losing her mother could have affected her memory. Isn't it possible you saw a nurse giving your mother medication, not your stepmother? No, Sophie said firmly. I know what Rachel looks like, and nurses wear scrubs. Rachel was wearing her black dress, the one she wore to important meetings. You were only 6 years old. Sometimes children have bad dreams that seem very real. I know the difference between dreams and real life, Sophie interrupted. Dreams don't leave bruises. Dreams don't make you throw up blood. Dreams don't kill your mommy. When Sophie finally stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. She walked steadily back to her grandmother, courage padding beside her, and climbed into Margaret's lap as if she were much younger than her 7 years. The defense presented their case over the next 2 days. Character witnesses who testified to Rachel's professional success, a psychologist who suggested Sophie might be suffering from false memory syndrome, an attempt to discredit the enhanced security footage. But the vial of potassium chloride with Rachel's partial fingerprint, discovered when crime scene technicians had processed it, was impossible to explain away. Rachel herself took the stand on the final day, maintaining her innocence with cool precision. She painted a picture of herself as a woman who had tried to step into a maternal role for a disturbed, grieving child who had rejected her at every turn. She claimed Sophie's accusations were elaborate fantasies born of trauma and resentment, but under Amanda Reeves's methodical cross-examination, cracks appeared in Rachel's facade. Her story about why she was at the hospital after hours changed slightly with each telling. She couldn't explain why she had a vial of potassium chloride, finally claiming she must have picked it up by accident while visiting Emma. And the life insurance policy you took out on Emma Chen without her knowledge, Amanda pressed. I was concerned about Sophie's future. Emma was like a sister to me. I wanted to make sure Sophie would be provided for. So concerned that you accessed Emma's personal information illegally to forge her signature on the application. Rachel's attorney objected, but the damage was done. The jury had seen the forged documents, had heard the handwriting expert's testimony. Grace was called as the final rebuttal witness, describing Sophie's condition when she arrived at the hospital, the pattern of injuries inconsistent with Rachel's explanations, and most powerfully, the moment when Sophie had finally found the courage to share her truth. In my 15 years as a pediatric nurse, Grace testified, I've seen many traumatized children. What struck me about Sophie was not just her silence, but the deliberate nature of her communication through the paper. Hearts. This wasn't a child lost in fantasy. This was a child who had found the only safe way she could to carry and eventually share a terrible truth. The jury deliberated for only 6 hours. Grace sat with the Chen family in a small room at the courthouse, Sophie coloring quietly, while the adults pretended to read magazines. When the bailiff finally called them back, Sophie reached for Grace's hand on one side and her father's on the other. On the count of murder in the first degree, we find the defendant, Rachel Chen, guilty. On the count of attempted murder, we find the defendant guilty. On 3 counts of child abuse, we find the defendant guilty. The word guilty echoed through the courtroom with each count, a drumbeat of justice that seemed to lift years from Sophie's small shoulders. Rachel's carefully maintained composure finally shattered as the verdicts were read. She turned to stare at Sophie with such venom that the bailiff stepped closer, ready to intervene, but Sophie didn't flinch. She stood up, still holding Grace's hand, and met Rachel's gaze steadily. Then she did something extraordinary. She took the red paper heart she'd been holding throughout the trial and placed it deliberately on the defense table in front of Rachel. "This is for you," Sophie said clearly. "Mommy taught me that love is stronger than hate. I'm not afraid of you anymore." The moment stretched, electric with significance, before the bailiffs led Rachel away. The formerly powerful woman looked suddenly small, diminished not by the guilty verdict, but by the grace of the child she'd tried to destroy. Later, standing outside the courthouse in the crisp November air, Sophie tugged on Grace's coat. "Will you come to Thanksgiving?" she asked. "Nana's cooking and Daddy's learning to make Mommy's special stuffing. We want you to be there." Grace looked at the small family that had been shattered and rebuilt. Daniel, still learning to forgive. Himself, but devoted to healing. Margaret, the grandmother who had known something was wrong and now served as a pillar of strength. And Sophie, the little girl whose courage had brought justice for her mother and freedom for herself. "I wouldn't miss it," Grace promised. As she drove home that evening, Grace thought about the paper hearts that had started everything. Sophie still made them, but now they were all different colors. Blue for happiness, yellow for hope, green for new beginnings. The red ones were reserved for special occasions, for moments when love needed to be especially strong. In her apartment, Grace opened a drawer and pulled out the red paper heart Sophie had given her that first day, the one she'd pressed into her hand with such desperate trust. She unfolded it carefully, something she hadn't done before out of respect for Sophie's privacy. Inside, in crayon so faint it was barely visible, were 3 words: "Please help me." Grace refolded the heart with the same care Sophie had always shown, tucking it back in the drawer. Tomorrow she would return to the hospital to other children who might need someone to listen, to see beyond the obvious, to create space for truth to emerge. But tonight, she simply sat with the knowledge that sometimes the smallest acts, kneeling to a child's level, asking the right questions, believing the unbelievable, could change everything. Somewhere across the city, Sophie Chen was probably making new paper hearts, filling them with drawings of a future that was finally hers to imagine. Her mother's legacy lived on, not in silence and fear, but in the careful folds of paper, in the courage to speak truth, and in the unwavering belief that love was indeed stronger than hate. The red paper hearts had led them all to this moment. A child saved, a murder solved, a family beginning to heal. And in the end, Grace reflected, that was the real miracle. Not just that Sophie had found her voice, but that when she finally spoke, the world had chosen to listen. As winter settled over Portland, bringing with it the promise of new beginnings, Grace knew that Sophie's story would stay with her always. It would inform every interaction with frightened children, every moment when silence spoke louder than words, every instance when the truth lay hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone patient enough to see it. The paper hearts had shown the way, and Grace would never forget their lesson, that love, carefully folded and faithfully carried, could survive the darkest circumstances and emerge eventually into the light. The Christmas lights twinkled along Morrison Street as Grace Mitchell made her way toward the Chen household, a casserole dish balanced in one hand and a wrapped gift in the other. 2 years had passed since that November day when justice had finally been served, and the biting December wind carried memories of transformation rather than tragedy. The house in the West Hills neighborhood looked different now. Where once manicured hedges had stood in perfect formation, Rachel's insistence on rigid control, extending even to the landscaping, now grew a cheerful tangle of winter jasmine and evergreen clematis. Children's drawings decorated the windows, and a handmade wreath adorned the front door, its centerpiece a cascade of paper hearts in every color imaginable. Sophie answered the door before Grace could knock, as if she'd been watching from the window. At 9 years old, she had grown into her features, her dark eyes bright with an intelligence that no longer needed to hide behind silence. "Nurse Grace, you came." The title had stuck, even though their relationship had evolved far beyond medical care. Grace had become a fixture in their rebuilt life, accepting invitations to birthdays, school plays, and holiday gatherings. She'd watched Sophie transform from a traumatized victim into a confident child who spoke at schools about recognizing abuse and finding safe adults to trust. "Of course I came," Grace said, stepping into the warmth of the house. "I wouldn't miss your Christmas recital for anything." The interior had changed as dramatically as the exterior. Gone were the stark white walls and minimalist furniture that Rachel had favored. The living room now burst with color. Children's artwork framed and displayed with the same care usually reserved for expensive paintings, comfortable, overstuffed. Furniture that invited lounging and photographs everywhere. Emma Chen smiled from dozens of frames, no longer a hidden memory, but a celebrated presence in their daily lives. Daniel emerged from the kitchen, wearing an apron dusted with flour. The years had softened him too, the rigid businessman replaced. by a father who had learned to prioritize presence over profit. He'd cut back his hours at the investment firm, dedicating his evenings to Sophie's homework, her therapy appointments, and the simple joy of being available. Grace, perfect timing. He called. Sophie's about to practice her song one more time before we head to the recital. The piano that had once stood silent in the corner, Rachel had forbidden Sophie from playing it, claiming the noise gave her migraines, now served as the heart of their home. Sophie slid onto the bench with easy confidence, her fingers finding the keys with practiced precision. The melody that filled the room was hauntingly beautiful, a piece she'd composed herself for the school's winter concert. "I call it Hearts Unfolded," Sophie explained, her fingers never faltering as she played. "It's about how secrets can't stay folded forever, how love finds a way to open everything up." Grace felt tears prick her eyes as she listened. The music seemed to tell Sophie's entire story, the minor keys of fear and loss gradually giving way to major chords of hope and triumph. It was sophisticated beyond what most 9-year-olds could produce, but then Sophie had lived through more than most children her age. Margaret Lou entered from the kitchen, carrying a tray of hot chocolate. Sophie's grandmother had moved to Portland permanently after the trial, selling her Seattle home to be closer to her granddaughter. The arrangement had brought healing to multiple generations. Margaret finding purpose in Sophie's daily care, and Sophie gaining the maternal presence she'd craved. "She's been practicing for weeks," Margaret said proudly, setting down the tray. "Her teacher says she has real talent. Emma would be so proud." The mention of Emma no longer brought the sharp pain it once had. She had become part of their daily conversation, her memory woven into the fabric of their reconstructed family. Sophie often shared stories of her mother at school, helping other children understand that grief and joy could coexist. As they prepared to leave for the recital, Sophie disappeared upstairs, returning with a small wrapped box. "This is for you," she said, presenting it to Grace with unusual solemnity. "For Christmas, but I want you to open it now." Inside, nestled in tissue paper, lay a silver charm bracelet. Each charm was a tiny origami heart, crafted from metal but capturing the delicate folds of Sophie's paper creations. A small card explained that Sophie had worked with a local jeweler, providing the paper models for each charm. "There are 8 hearts," Sophie explained, pointing to each one. "Red for the first day we met, when I couldn't talk but you still heard me. White for truth, blue for trust, yellow for hope, green for new beginnings, purple for courage, orange for joy, and pink for love." Grace fastened the bracelet around her wrist, the tiny hearts catching the light. "It's perfect, Sophie. I'll treasure it always." The school auditorium buzzed with excitement as families found their seats. The winter recital was a beloved tradition, but this year held special significance. Sophie had been chosen to perform the finale, her original composition closing the evening's program. As they waited for the concert to begin, several people approached their group. Teachers who had watched Sophie emerge from selective mutism, classmates' parents who had supported the family through the trial, medical professionals who had testified on Sophie's behalf. The community that had rallied around them remained strong, a network of support that had proven crucial to their healing. "Sophie's become quite the advocate," Mrs. Peterson, the school counselor, mentioned to Grace. "She started a peer support group for children dealing with trauma. She calls it Hearts Unfolded, like her song. They meet every Wednesday at lunch." Grace wasn't surprised. Sophie had channeled her experience into purpose, becoming exactly the kind of safe person she had once desperately needed. The paper hearts that had once been her only means of communication had evolved into a symbol of hope for other children finding their voices. When Sophie finally took the stage for the finale, the auditorium fell silent. She sat at the piano, with the poise of someone much older, her small hands resting on the keys. Before beginning, she spoke into the microphone. "This song is dedicated to my mum, Emma Chen, who taught me that love is stronger than fear. To my dad and Nana, who helped me learn to trust again. And to Nurse Grace, who showed me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is whisper your truth to someone who will listen." The music began, flowing from Sophie's fingers like water, over stones. The melody was more complex than what she'd played at home, enriched by the acoustics of the auditorium and the weight of the moment. Grace watched transfixed as Sophie poured 2 years of healing into every note. The composition told a story without words, darkness giving way to dawn, silence breaking into song, fear transforming into strength. When the final notes faded, the silence held for a breathless moment before the auditorium erupted in applause. Sophie stood and bowed, her face radiant with accomplishment. As she left the stage, her eyes found Grace in the audience, and she smiled with such pure joy that Grace felt her heart constrict. This was what healing looked like. Not the absence of scars, but the ability to transform wounds into wisdom, silence into song. After the recital, as families mingled in the lobby, a woman approached Grace hesitantly. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, with tired eyes and a toddler balanced on her hip. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Are you Grace Mitchell, the nurse who helped Sophie Chen?" Grace nodded, curious about the woman's nervous demeanor. "I'm Jennifer Martin. I read about the case in the papers about how you notice things others. Miss, I wondered, could I talk to you about my daughter?" She gestured to the toddler, who was sucking her thumb and staring at the floor. "She hasn't spoken since my ex-husband had his last visitation. The doctors say there's nothing physically wrong, but..." Grace felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the recognition of another child potentially trapped in silence by unspeakable experiences. She glanced at Sophie, who was watching the interaction with knowing eyes. "Of course," Grace said, pulling out her card. "Call the hospital tomorrow. Ask for the pediatric ward and mention my name. We'll make sure someone sees her right away." As Jennifer walked away, clutching the card like a lifeline, Sophie moved closer to Grace. "She's scared like I was," she observed quietly. "But now she knows someone will listen." The ripple effects of Sophie's courage continued to spread, touching lives in ways they couldn't have imagined. Grace had become known in the Portland medical community as someone with a gift for hearing what children couldn't say, for creating the safe spaces where truth could emerge. Later that evening, as the Chen family and Grace gathered for their traditional post-recital celebration at a local restaurant, Sophie presented another surprise. From her backpack, she pulled out a manuscript neatly typed and bound. "I wrote a book," she announced. "Well, it's more like a long story, but Miss Rodriguez, my teacher, helped me type it up properly. She thinks maybe it could help other kids." The title page read, "The Heart Folder's Guide, How to Tell Secrets That Are Too Big for Words," by Sophie Chen, age 9. Daniel's eyes misted as he flipped through the pages. The book was illustrated with Sophie's own drawings, showing children how to communicate through art, music, and yes, paper hearts when words failed them. It included a section for adults too, warning signs to watch for, questions to ask, ways to create safe spaces for disclosure. "The dedication," Margaret said softly, pointing to the front page. Grace read it aloud. "For Mommy, who taught me to fold love into small spaces. For Daddy, who learned to unfold the truth. For Nana, who never stopped believing. And for all the children whose voices are trapped inside paper hearts, waiting for someone to listen." The manuscript would eventually be published by a small press specializing in therapeutic books for children. It would find its way into hospitals, schools, and therapists' offices across the country. Sophie would donate every penny of proceeds to organizations supporting child abuse survivors. As dinner wound down and they prepared to head home, Sophie pulled Grace aside. "I have something else to tell you," she said, her voice serious. "I've decided what I want to be when I grow up." "Oh, what's that?" "A pediatric nurse like you, but also a therapist, and maybe a police officer too. I want to be all the people who help kids like me." She paused, considering. "Is that too many jobs?" Grace knelt down to Sophie's level just as she had that first day in the hospital. "You know what I think? I think you'll be exactly who you need to be. And whoever that is, you'll help more children than you can imagine." Sophie nodded solemnly, then brightened. "Will you teach me about being a nurse, I mean? When I'm older, it would be my honor," Grace promised. As they parted ways in the restaurant parking lot, snow began to fall, the first of the season. Sophie caught flakes on her tongue, laughing with the pure delight of childhood reclaimed. Watching her, Grace marveled at the journey they'd all taken from that gray March morning to this crystalline December night. The paper hearts that had once littered a hospital floor in desperate silence now adorned Sophie's book, her support group materials, and even jewelry worn by those who understood their significance. They had become a symbol, not of secrets and fear, but of courage and communication. Driving home through the gently falling snow, Grace touched the charm bracelet on her wrist. 8 tiny hearts, each representing a stage in Sophie's journey from victim to survivor to advocate. She thought of Jennifer Martin and her silent toddler, of all the children still trapped in wordless fear, and felt the weight of responsibility that came with being someone who knew how to listen. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Thank you for believing in paper hearts. Love, your favorite heart folder." Grace smiled, typing back, "Thank you for teaching me their language. Love always, Nurse Grace." As she pulled into her driveway, Grace noticed a red paper heart tucked under her windshield wiper. She retrieved it carefully, unfolding it in the glow of her porch light. Inside, Sophie had drawn 2 figures, one tall, one small, standing before a Christmas tree. Above them, she'd written, "Family isn't just blood. It's the people who listen when you can only whisper." Grace carried the heart inside, adding it to her collection in the special drawer where she kept all of Sophie's creations. Each one told a part of the story, from the desperate early messages to the joyful recent ones. Together, they formed a narrative of transformation that Grace would carry with her always. In the quiet of her apartment, surrounded by the soft glow of her own Christmas lights, Grace reflected on how a single moment of attention, noticing paper hearts on a hospital floor, had changed the trajectory of multiple lives. Sophie's courage had not only brought justice for her mother and safety for herself, but had created a legacy of advocacy that would touch countless other children. The red paper hearts had indeed shown the way, and their message was clear. Every child deserves someone who will listen, who will believe, who will act. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the most important truths. Sometimes love, carefully folded and bravely shared, can unfold into justice, healing, and hope. As snow continued to fall over Portland, Grace knew that somewhere in the city, other children were folding their own paper hearts, carrying secrets too heavy for their small shoulders. And she knew with absolute certainty that she would continue to be someone who noticed, who listened, who believed, because that's what Sophie had taught her, that saving one child could create ripples that spread infinitely outward, touching lives in ways no one could predict. The paper hearts had started as a symbol of one girl's desperate truth. They had become a movement of children finding their voices and adults learning to hear them. And in that transformation lay the real miracle, not just that Sophie had survived and thrived, but that her courage had lit a path for others to follow. The hearts continued to unfold, revealing new truths, creating new connections, fostering new hope. As Grace prepared for bed, she noticed one more text from Sophie. Made 100 hearts today for the Children's Hospital. Want to help deliver them tomorrow? Absolutely, Grace typed back. Pick you up at 10. The cycle continued. Love folded into paper, courage shared through action, hope spreading one heart at a time. And Grace knew that this was just the beginning of Sophie's impact on the world. The little girl who had once been silenced by fear had found her voice, and she was using it to ensure that no child would ever have to suffer in silence again. The paper hearts had shown the way forward, and they would continue to guide them, all toward a future where every child's truth was heard, believed, and honored. It was Sophie's gift to the world, a legacy of love that began with a whisper and grew into a chorus of voices raised in truth and triumph. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.